Hello and welcome to my latest video. In this video I'm going to be showing you how to paint one of the new Vampire Lords from the Soulblight Grave Lords. You can see I've already completely stuck the model together and primed it black. However, I would advise you not to do this. You're going to see in a moment why that is. You can see it as well. Obviously I've primed it black, so I've used Ultimate Primer. But here's the reason why. So I started to paint the face for the second part of the video, and I couldn't get the brush around to all the areas that I needed it to, so I had to rip it off, and of course after it's already glued on you make a bit of a mess doing that. I'd also say just to be on the safe side, if you wanted, don't glue the shield on. I'm not too bothered about it. I'll manage it, but it will definitely be easier to paint the model without the shield and the head attached. But apart from that, it's fine. So to start with, I'm just using some Vallejo neutral grey, and I'm mapping out the highlight points. This is going to be painted in a kind of a non-metallic steel, I guess. I'm not overly concerned with the exact material, but it's definitely sort of a desaturated non-metallic looking effect. And the neutral grey is really handy for that, because obviously it's a very desaturated colour. It's pretty much just black and white. So, and as I said, just to start with, I'm just mapping out the light points on it. Now, because of the way the model is sculpted, the face actually, like the front of the face, is pointing right from where I'm holding the model. So if you rotated it around, but from that angle, and that's the angle how Games Workshop shows off the model as well. You see the front of the shield as, but it doesn't. I don't think it has the best angle for it. So I'm picking kind of like a more straight on, or more 3/4 view, I suppose. So you see a bit of the shield, a good chunk of the face, and the main thing is the nice armor. I don't think people quite saw how nice the design of the armor is on this, and I really wanted to show that aspect of it as the main part of the model. And one of the really nice parts as well are these kind of hip covers, I guess they are, because they've got some nice curves on them, which allows me to do some really nice random reflections. So you can see how I said I was mapping out the light points. The easy ones to map out are the same as how the light hits the model. So you can see on the top of the hip there, at the bottom of the rib cage was that kind of like flared out lip. All those kind of areas, they are, it's very straightforward to pick those out. The problem arises when it becomes the more flat surfaces, or just the random shapes on the model, because obviously as a metallic surface you want to have reflections on there, but you don't actually know what to reflect. Now, I'm not painting this as a chrome, so it's like a sky earth non-metallic metal. If you did it like that, then you would be painting all of the reflections of like the weapon and the shield and all sorts of things like that in it. That would look cool, but I don't want to spend the amount of time that it would require to work all that out. So I'm doing a more diffused kind of light. So it means that the surface isn't a mirror finish, but it's still kind of shiny. And that's the sort of armor that you would get on most kind of realistic metal surfaces that's used in armor anyway. It will allow me to, if I want, add a little bit of color here and there, but the main thing that you're going to see is that so none of the reflections are going to be obviously anything. They're just going to be like little shine points and just random marks and things. And if you look how I'm applying the paint to the model, the kind of random scratchy nature of it really helps that out. So I can do these marks looking at how the light's naturally hitting it anyway, and then kind of filling in the area around that with more sort of scratchy shapes. And then as I build up on top of it, I can then either decide if these look like something I'd want to push a bit further, or I can then knock them back a bit, just tweaking it as I go along. To start with, it's quite a quick process, these sketchy marks. And what you will find as well is if you just cover the whole model just doing this, it actually looks quite cool anyway. I'm almost tempted to do some of the base kind of troop models for the army in this kind of sketchy style, and then just pick out a few highlights on there. I think that would look quite nice on the tabletop. It's still got that really dark and moody look to it. But obviously it'd be a bit quicker than the process I'm going to use here, because it is a slight problem. So I'm painting this pretty much up to a display standard, and it takes a while doing all the very fine blending, because I have to point out you will be able to see some of the brush marks and things in this, but this is a very tiny model. It's much smaller than a Space Marine, not just in height but in the chunkiness of it as well. So the arms are very thin, all those kind of details. It just makes it a little bit more tricky when you're doing some of the blending, because you just don't have the space to get the different transitions in there. So it's sort of the easier thing to do is to go very high contrast, and then just blend in at the very edges, which is more of what I'm going to be doing for the highlights on this, because if you try and do subtle highlights, they're going to be almost invisible. But yeah, also, as you can see, I'm still at the moment still working on the neutral grey, and they're not super neat marks, but as I'm going over it a bit more now, I am neatening it up a little bit. The smaller the scratchy marks that you make, they will work like blending, so kind of like little cross hatches, but don't try to make it too obviously cross hatched. Sort of vary the angles all over, so it will work like shading. So the further apart you keep the lines, the more of the black primer will show through. The closer together you make it, until it gets all the way to a really opaque solid colour, which will then work for where the bright highlights go. But of course, you can still see all the scratchy marks on there, and that means that you will need to blend on top of those if you want to do it up to kind of like the same sort of level. However, you don't have to do that. You can still do the same process that I'm going to do, but if you want to, but more quickly. So basically just don't spend as much time blending, but you still want to get all the same highlights spots, not necessarily in the same place. You can put whatever highlight spots on there, because the thing is that a lot of the highlights that I'm placing on there are just random. It's just if I think they look interesting or not in the area. So for example, I was talking about those hip armor pieces, like so I said, at the top that's where the light hits it, but further down that you go, they're just sort of very lightly curved panels, and you can just put whatever reflections in there that you want. If you really wanted, you could just leave them black as well, but that would mean that there's very little light hitting the model, but it would be very, very high contrast, and you can still make it interesting. So at this stage, I'm jumping really quickly up to the highlights, so I'm going straight to ice yellow. Now ice yellow from neutral grey, it's a massive tonal step. It's not far off white. It's just a very warm white pretty much. So don't look too much on the wet palette for how for the colour, because it looks quite yellow on the wet palette, but you can see when I apply it to the model, it looks much more desaturated. It's just, as I said, a slightly warm looking white colour, and I'm applying it quite thinly as well, so even it's looking even less yellow than the actual paint colour is. The reason for that is because of the translucency of the paint. You're getting the neutral grey showing through, which is helping to desaturate the look of the colour as well. If you layer up the ice yellow, and we will be doing that to an opaque finish on the brightest highlights, you'll see more of the actual colour of the paint. But as I was saying, don't look too closely at the colour of the paint on the wet palette, because it looks quite yellow on there. Part of the reason for that is the paint separates slightly, so you get more of the yellow colour floating on the surface. If you look to the left hand side of the ice yellow on the wet palette, you can see it's a bit more mixed in there, and that gives a more accurate colour for what the ice yellow looks like. To the right of that, you see all the kind of like darker yellowy kind of colour. That is not an accurate depiction of how the colour will look. Now I love ice yellow as a colour. Really good to work with. I use it in a lot of non-metallics, especially, you probably know that if you've watched a few of my videos. I particularly like it for gold colours, but it is nice to use on the more desaturated steel type colours, because it adds that kind of hint of warmth to the metal effect, which kind of suggests a warm light hitting the model. Now, if you don't want a warm light, if you wanted cold lights hitting the model, then stay away from the ice yellow and go more to like a pale grey blue type colour, because that doesn't have the yellow elements in it, and it will give a much colder finish to the model. I think for the ice yellow, you can kind of see what the direction that I'm going with. So it's very, very similar, the marking, to the neutral grey at this stage. I'm not being super neat. However, just to always keep it in mind, it's a zoomed in video and it's a very small model. So you're seeing brush marks that they look quite big on the video, but they're really quite small in reality. So again, like this is, if you put this on the table, it would look great already. You wouldn't need to be neater or anything. If you're only looking for a tabletop standard, you're already there at this stage. You just finish the model up like that, it'll be fine. It's only when you want to kind of push the quality of the finish up to sort of display level, or just to push yourself for fun, enjoyment, or whatever. That's when the extra blending and things come in. But this slightly zoomed out shot here, you can already see how much shinier it looks. So the further away you get from this, the shinier it sort of looks, because the bright high contrast really comes into its own. Then the closer you look, you see more of the scratchy marks, and that kind of doesn't look quite as metallic. But hopefully by the end of the process, where I've kind of really sort of spent some time blending it, putting the refinements in there, it'll look good even at very close viewing angles. You can see the marks that I'm making now. I'm doing them, they're much finer, and so I'm still only using the two colours, but with a small amount of paint, and you just keep layering it up and doing these very small fine marks, it will kind of blend anyway. You don't always need to mix different colours to blend layers, because of the translucency of the paint, and you're using thinned paint anyway. It as you layer on top of it, you can get very good transitions just by using one colour of paint. But you do have to be kind of precise with the marks that you're making. So you're looking for so if you see like little darker bumps and things, then you have to focus on those to get rid of them, or just to help with the blending in certain areas. You're looking for very precise little parts to place the brush on. It's not a case of just randomly doing lots of these little marks. You have to be much more controlled in the placement of the brush. So the bulk of the work, when you're starting off with the neutral grey and then going to the ice yellow, you can be much more loose and not quite as focused. You're putting the marks everywhere. But as it gets more and more refined, you have to be very considerate of where you put each of these marks, because you need to get away from some of the imperfections in the translucency. So sometimes you'll get areas where the paint is more or less opaque, and you need to balance it out. That's where the refinement comes in. But of course, I mean, it's still not going to give you a perfect finish. So you do have to keep the paint thin at this stage, because it's a lot of layers, at least 1.5 parts water to 1 part paint. But you can go even thinner. On the next video that I've already filmed, that will be up along with this one, we'll be painting the head for the vampire. I pushed the consistency even further, so it becomes much thinner layers of paint, and I'll explain that more on that video as well. But the thinner the paint, the more layers you can make. You just have to do just be more careful with how you place them, so that it covers exactly how you want. The thicker the paint, or the more opaque the paint, it's not such a big issue, because as you put the marks down, you can very easily cover the area you want. With the thinner paint, it obviously doesn't cover very well, but it does give you the option of doing many layers to get the exact look that you want. You can see here as I've been going over certain areas more than others with the ice yellow, so the brightest highlights are now becoming much more opaque. You can see that the crease where it's nice and bright, or the bright highlight on the lip that comes out from the chest. It's just a case, as I said, of layering up on top of it and taking your time and really seeing where the highlights need to go to be brighter. It's still not going to look excessively non-metallic at this stage, but it will start to look interesting, for want of a better word. But once you actually get to the section towards the end of the video where you start glazing the colours on to smooth everything together, that will really be where the shine starts to appear. And the final stage of putting the white highlights will push the contrast even further, and so you'll have a really nice high contrast non-metallic metal then. Really, probably the hardest thing in doing the non-metallic on this model is just because there are so many shapes and angles on the armour. Like, if the armour had just been smooth, let's say if you've seen the new Stormcast Eternals that Games Workshop have previewed for the new box game, they have got really nice armour, but it's all very simple curves. It doesn't have any of these concave panels like on the hips and things. There's lots of concave curves on this, which makes it a bit trickier to figure out the angles, whereas all the very the convex, the easy curves on all the Stormcast, it's much easier to paint the reflections on those because you can just see how the light hits it. Whereas for this, you have to be a bit more creative in how they appear. So now I've added some Mournfang brown to the wet palette, and this is going to add some colour to it. Now you have to be really careful. I love Mournfang brown. It's really great for non-metallics. I use it quite a lot as well for gold. For this, you have to be very restrained in how you use it because, one, it's a lot darker than the ice yellow and it's quite a rich colour. So if you go over the top on this, it's not going to look like a steel type colour at all. It's going to go brown. You just want this at the transition edges or in the darker areas. But because I know ahead of time that I'm going to be highlighting on top of these, I can be a little bit heavier on some of the highlights. But just keep in mind, try not to go over too much of any of the higher highlights. So anything with ice yellow on, really, like maybe in the sort of where the ice yellow crosses over into the neutral grey a bit, you want to get a bit of Mournfang brown in there because that allows you to see the colour without it taking over. But if you start putting it on anything that's looking quite opaque as an ice yellow, it's going to make it look dirty. It completely kill the shine effect. I know at this stage as well, like it looks sort of more messy, even though I've added some of the Mournfang brown, but it looks more messy than that lip under the chest. You might think, well, maybe it looked better before, but it will. You have to trust the process, and it will get there. And having that little bit of colour on just helps it a lot. Here you can see I'm pushing it up to white as well, and this helps with the high contrast look, so it will make it quite shiny. So basically, there I just spent time carrying on, pretty much stippling, to help blend the colours together. So it was exactly what I've been doing. You've seen the whole process. It's just a case of taking your time, stippling the paint. And this is why, like I stress it again, at least 1.5 parts water to 1 part paint, because you're doing so many layers, keep the paint thin. It's not such a big issue for the sketch stage, but if you can keep that thin as well, it helps because obviously you're still adding more layers on top of it. But especially for the more whiter colours, they can get chalky very quickly. So thin, keep it thin. So now we're going to be glazing on colours. So now it's Mournfang brown again, but this is watered down very, very heavily. This is like 5-6 parts water to paint. Check it before you apply it to the model. It should just leave a very soft, subtle mark on the model. If when you touch the paint to the model, you can see a clear mark, it's too thick, there's too much paint in it, go back, add more water, and try again. Test it really on your thumbnail, something like that, or on a white piece of ceramic, anything so that you can see how hard the mark is going to be. So you can see there how I applied the Mournfang brown glazes. They're very, very subtle, but they're just enough to add that hint of colour. So now I'm adding black as well. The black will go over the Mournfang brown glazes and it will desaturate them a bit. So if you've gone slightly heavy on the Mournfang brown with the colours, you can then knock it back again with the black. The black also pushes the contrast, so it gets even darker in the shadows. You'll get some of the scratchy marks that you made with the neutral grey. They will still show through, but they become more subtle, and those areas just become darker naturally because of having the black glazed on top. Then you're doing the same with the white, but kind of the opposite. So on the highlight areas, you're taking white, again, very, very heavily watered down. White is like a pretty horrible paint to glaze with. The black's not so much of a problem. That's one of the easiest colours to glaze. White is the hardest. White, you have to water it down, again, 5, 6, maybe more parts water. Test it, always test it. I'm using P3 Morrow White. Each white paint is different depending on the company. It's not always easy to find a good white because they can go chalky so easily. But load up the brush, rub it on some kitchen towel, test it to make sure. You can see as I'm applying this, you can hardly see any marks I'm making, but it is making a difference. It just takes time. So you do a layer, let it dry, same process over and over. It'll be better if you could do larger areas. Now, obviously for me, I'm doing this so I can show you in the video, so I have to focus on a small area because it will take too long to do the whole process over the whole model. To show you just that one, the same technique over and over. And so I'm going to have to do that in my spare time. But I think you can see, especially on that panel that I've worked on more now, how everything is now blended much better together. And you can glaze it higher if you want, but try and keep some of the sort of the Mournfang brown and ice yellow colours showing through, but they're supposed to be very subtle. They just help with that kind of like the warm shine. Here you can see I'm adding a bounce highlight to the bottom of the chest. It's a little bit tricky to get this just right. At the moment I'm just sketching it in, so this is quite a few steps back from obviously where I pushed the highlights on the hip armour, or hip and thigh, whatever it is. So I've got to go back again and go through the whole process again. But the chest, if you pay attention, is facing downwards. It sort of curves at the top, so the highlight there, there's like a little sort of semicircle almost cut in the top, with these little spiky parts pointing upwards. That's not quite facing downwards, so you can get a nice bit of glow in. However, as it curves underneath. That's all going to be very, very dark. I'll show you a photo at the end. You might have seen it in my social media as well of the stage that Matt's on the vampire at the moment, and you'll see that area looks, there's no highlights as such. There's a little bit like a small hint of colour, but not too much because it's not catching the direct upwards facing light. But because it is a shiny non-metallic surface, you do need to put some bounce highlights in there. And because that lip that's just going over the hip slightly is so bright, that will reflect back up and hit into the low downwards facing surface of the chest armour, or kind of like the belly armour. But you don't want it to be as bright as the white highlight there. So it's pretty much a balance. But all you have to do is just do the same process that I did, that I've already shown you, but don't take it up to pure white, and then you can glaze over the top of it as well with the Mournfang brown and the Abaddon black, and it'll make it look so it's like a reflection, but not a reflection that's going to overpower the light that it's reflecting from. I mean, really, for this model, it's a fantastic model for practicing non-metallics on, because it is a little bit harder to do, but it's still not an overly complex model. So it's harder to do than Stormcast. Like, everybody paints Stormcast as non-metallic. You've probably seen hundreds of them. Some of them are amazing as well. And I'm also going to be painting more Stormcast, especially the new ones when they come out. I'll be painting some of those as non-metallics as well. But for something like this is a little bit harder, but still the whole of the armour is non-metallic. It's not. So sometimes it can be a bit frustrating when you pick a model and it has lots of different surfaces on, because you have to change your paint colours and everything, and it all has to be worked out differently. Whereas something like this, the whole model is painted pretty much the same, or using the same coloured paints. Then it's just a case of where you want the bright parts, where you want the dull parts, light and dark, that kind of thing. But you don't have to swap the paints over. So it's actually very simple to do in that regard. You can just focus on the actual painting. So it's brilliant for testing that kind of thing out. Where you can really focus and practice your skills for your non-metallics. But obviously, like, if you're just starting out for non-metals, then something like a Stormcast Eternal is much easier to work out for the highlights on it. Now I'm just showing you a little bit more, like another armour panel basically, because so it's this shoulder panel that goes up into a giant neck guard. So I'm just showing you the shoulder panel for this stage. I might do another video on like some different areas if I feel, like, while I'm painting it, if I feel like they're different enough to warrant it. It's a bit tricky because, as I said, it is all the same colour and the same kind of idea. So it might be that you get bored of watching anymore. But I will be doing... So obviously I've already said there is another video for the head and the hair. And then I'll do another video for the weapon and the shield, because those are going to be different as well. And then there will be a final video for the base. I think that probably will be enough for this model, because it's just not complex enough. However, if I do find there are parts on it that need a little bit more attention, or are, as I said, different enough to warrant it, then I will show you those as well. But like, I've got a lot of these vampires, so I've bought all the new vampires. I've gone a little bit crazy with them, and I've got a big bill now. But I will be showing those off as I paint them, or at least parts of them. Some will be more tabletop standard, so a lot quicker than this. Others will be up to the same sort of standard as well. But I hope you like vampires. But there's obviously I've got plenty of things to be working on. So the main thing for this shoulder pad, as I said, you've already seen the process, so you can see exactly what I'm doing. It's lots of small marks, just being very careful. Just make sure there's not a lot of paint on the brush is what I can, the biggest issue. Loads of people put a lot of paint on their brush. You just don't have the control that you need. You get a big lump of paint on there. It's drying all the time. Like, what's on the brush, it's drying. As soon as it touches the model, it's drying again. As soon as you push it out, it's drying even faster. If you've got a lot of paint on the brush, and while it's drying, you're going to end up with more kind of bumpy finishes. So that's why thinner paint with more water, but just putting a very small amount on the brush, will give a much smoother finish and allow you to do the extra layers that you want. But if you want to paint quickly, then obviously thicker paint, but you just have to move quickly when you're doing that to make sure it doesn't dry out. So another thing, if you look on the wet palette now, you might notice that what was ice yellow now looks like a muddy grey colour. So what I did was I decided that because I wanted to work on the transitions a little bit more easily, and this is quite important if you're finding that you can't get the transitions right, is I've done a 50-50 mix of ice yellow and neutral grey. I just moved some of the paint, I took a dab out of the wet palette from the neutral grey, put it into the ice yellow, mixed it up, and then if you look in the bottom right, I put some more ice yellow on there. So now I've got a 3-step highlight, so I can start with neutral grey, paint on the ice yellow for the block highlights, but then I can go back and use the 50-50 mix, and just to help transition the colours at the edges. It just makes it a little bit easier to get the smooth finish as you need it. But obviously, doing that, if you just use it and leave it like that, it's actually going to look duller than the other one because you're getting more sort of grey area and not enough of the ice yellow. So once I've done that, I go back with the ice yellow because you need to get the ice yellow on this shoulder particularly, because the shoulder and the head are more focal points. Now, I mean, it's not quite so important on this model because, as I said, all the armour is the same, so I can do other things to make the head a focal point, but I still want to get the highlights a little bit brighter up near the shoulder. It's a bit tricky actually because the shoulder is smaller, whereas those lovely upwards facing elements on the hip armour and the thigh armour, very easy to make those bright. This shoulder armour is a lot trickier from that perspective. It's a more complex shape, or well, it's kind of like the same shape, but it's shrunk down. So the curves and the angles and things are more extreme. And so, to make it brighter, you're having higher contrast as such. It makes it look a little bit weird. But you'll see, hopefully, as it progresses anyway, exactly what I'm talking about, because I'm going to try and make it as bright as possible. It was, like I said, it was tricky to get this little part right, and I might even go back and tweak it a bit more myself because it's not the easiest shape to make work. But fortunately, because of the way how people perceive non-metallics, what you'll find is that if you can get a few areas that look really good, and as long as the rest of the model is close enough, people will just accept that it all looks as a metal surface. You don't have to always make sure the whole model is up to the same standard. Now, if you're painting obviously for Golden Demon, then make sure that you try and get each part of the model up to as high a standard as you can, because someone will, and if someone will, then they'll get the trophy, and if you haven't, you won't. But it's quite tiring to do that all the time. So even if you're doing something up to display kind of standard, you don't have to put quite as much time into certain areas as others. Like if they're more tricky, as long as you can make it all look close enough, generally speaking, it'll be okay. But again, like I said, this particular shoulder is just a little bit tricky, so I thought it was worth showing you and seeing how I go with it as well. The tricky part mainly is the fact that it has that big crease going straight down the middle, and then there's little curves, kind of the curve in and outwards and things like that. As I mentioned, like it's a very tricky shape just to get right with light volumes. One thing that you could do if you want to sort of trick people, if you like, to get the non-metallic effect. Now, non-metallic from a basic perspective will work well if you just go light next to dark and dark next to light. And one of the easiest ways of doing that is edge highlighting. Now, if you go too crazy with edge highlighting, it stops looking natural and it looks very cartoonish. You just put an edge highlight all the way around something. It's no longer realistic. But you can do quite harsh edges that face upwards. Now, of course, not all upwards facing edges would catch light. It's very dependent on the angles for where the light's coming from and if the light would naturally catch the edge or not. But if you just want to push it a little bit and you think an area isn't looking quite non-metallic enough, then kind of push the edge highlights maybe brighter than you would normally if it's next to a dark section, and that high contrast will just help trick people into thinking that it's shiny because the light's catching the bright edge. It's just something that you have to be careful with, though. I think one of the nice things with painting more steel-like colours from non-metallic metal is that they don't look like caramel. One of the things I read quite often when I see people talking about non-metallics for gold especially, when they don't like it, is they say it looks like caramel. Generally speaking, if something looks like caramel, it's because you've got the light volumes wrong. if you know, so you need that light next to dark, you need large blocks of highlight. It's never a case of just doing a smooth transition. The smoother the transition going from light to dark, the less metallic it looks, because the light is actually suggesting it's very diffuse. If you look on the shoulder now, so I've obviously worked in a little bit more on the front part. I'm now glazing over with the Mournfang brown, but because the highlights, there's so much bright highlight on there, even the small amount of Mournfang brown that I've put on there has stained it a little bit, so I'm going to have to go back again with the ice yellow and the white and help to blend those little bits in. It's just, you know, it's just tricky on these small areas, because they are so small, just to get the blending right. I do find as well, when I did this, so when I'm looking at it in my hand, I couldn't necessarily see the little stain part that clearly, and it looked okay. When I took a photo of it, then, or as I'm looking at it in the video as well, it became much more clear that I needed to tweak it a bit more. So, you know, the final photo that you see is after I've gone back again and tweaked it a little bit further. But the process, like I said, the process that you're seeing is exactly the same that I do all the way through. It's just a case of how long you spend doing it, just to get it, you know, spot on, I suppose, or as close as you can get to it. So I think this video is about, yeah, it's nearly 40 minutes long, whereas I probably spent around about 2 hours maybe painting this. So as you can see, there's a lot of extra kind of fiddly stuff that goes on, but it's all exactly the same process that you see here. It's just a case that there's more of it. And also, if you notice, so this is the glazing stage. So as I mentioned, that the very thin Mournfang brown and the Abaddon black, around about 5 or 6 parts water to 1 part paint, and always test it. But if you'll notice that I was kind of stippling it on still, whereas when you saw the larger panel on the thighs and hips, I was doing longer strokes because it's just a larger area. Whereas the strokes here on the shoulder pad, they just need to be finer. You just need to spend more time doing it. Take your time trying to get that blend in. As I said, I'm probably going to go back and tweak it a little bit further as well. Just as it's, as I said, it's not the easiest shape to work out the highlights on. But the final stage of glazing the white on there, it does make a big difference. So even some of the areas that have, and again you saw this on the thigh section, even some of the areas that are a little bit darker, you're still glazing the white over it. So there you can see where I spent a bit more time working on it, glazed it loads and loads on that shoulder pad. I think that works pretty well actually at this stage now. You can see a few other areas that I've done as well. And like I said, exactly the same process for all the armour panels. Some are just lighter, some are darker, etc. And you can also see the head that's going to be in the next video. But anyway, that's the end of this video. Hope you enjoyed it. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.